Hey babe, check this out. Look at this.
He looks alright.
No, the fish tank. Get out of here. Hey guys, it's Adam here, the Australian Aquarist. If you're watching this video, it's probably because you saw the time-lapse YouTube video of the construction of my outdoor plywood aquarium. And thank you for watching and commenting on that. So this video here is actually, excuse my cockatoo, this video here is actually a bit of a shout out to those who commented and a bit of a Q&A and try and address some of the questions and concerns that you guys had. So I'm going to make it easy for you. Hang on a sec. If you had queries about the construction of the aquarium base, fast forward to about 45 seconds. If you had queries about waterproofing and sealing plywood aquariums, go to about 7 minutes in. If you were interested in the end wall construction, head to about 14 minutes in. The choice of glass, about 16 minutes in. And the big one, the concerns about me butt joining that front 2 panes of glass, thank you Reggie, about 18 minutes in. Thanks for watching guys, enjoy the video. Hey guys, it's Adam here, the Australian Aquarist. I thought I'd sit down and I'd go through a bunch of questions that were asked about the construction of a large plywood, outdoor Australian rainbowfish and turtle aquarium. And it's a hybrid between a plywood and a glass, but I also have 2 marine tanks inside. One's just over a 2,000 litre moray eel and sort of estuary large fish type aquarium. And it's a hybrid between a plywood and a glass. The other aquarium is my mixed coral reef tank, and it is a plywood base with 4 glass sides. So what I thought I'd do is just go through how I construct the base of the aquariums first. That is a bit critical when it comes to locating the glass and holding the glass in place. So this model here, this is pretty much the way I built the 2 indoor tanks. And what it is, I've actually used a lamination of 2 sheets of plywood. Now this is not the plywood I used, and I guess the plywood you would choose would vary depending upon the size of the tank you're building. In the tanks inside I used 19mm marine ply, so 2 sheets of that laminated together. The 2 sheets of plywood laminated together does 2 things. The first thing is it creates thickness and bulk to the bottom, so it's got plenty of weight and it's not inclined to bow. But of course that depends upon your stand as well. If you've got plenty of supports underneath the tank, then that won't be so much of an issue. The other thing that it actually does is it allows you to set the top sheet of plywood back from the bottom sheet by the thickness of the glass. It creates a lip. Now I don't know if you can see that. Hang on a minute. Stay there. I'm coming around. Now, I don't know if you guys can see that now, but you can see here for this model here, I've used some 6mm glass in the work shed here. So what I've done, I've set back this top sheet of plywood 6mm from the edge of the bottom sheet of plywood. What that does, it creates a lip that you can actually sit the glass on, and then when you screw this face board, and this could be timber, it could be aluminium, it could be steel, it could be anything. But when you screw this face board in place, it then creates this valley. The valley you can see just there. That holds the base of the glass in place. So that valley is equivalent to the width of the glass, and I usually add about 3mm or so, and that's for the silicone. The glass drops in place. I nip up this board here with the screws, and that holds the glass in nice and snug. Stay there. Demonstration for you. Here's my 6mm sheet of glass. Sits in there. Not holding it, you can see it staying in place. So there's no way, there's obviously a lot of water pressure at the bottom of the aquarium, trying to push that glass out. But of course with this piece of timber along the outside here, it actually holds the glass in place nicely. And the other thing I've done when I've actually used epoxy to coat the plywood, I did a test with the silicone I was using to see if the silicone would adhere and stick to the epoxy once it was cured. It does, it sticks really well. Now, obviously if you're going to build a just a plywood based aquarium and you're going to have 4 pieces of glass around the perimeter, you want the top sheet of that plywood to be recessed in the thickness of the glass, plus about 3 mil for silicone, all the way around. So you want to create that lip, that edge, all the way around. You'll put this face piece of timber or steel or aluminium all the way around, and then the glass will sit in that. You can silicone up the edges as per normal you would with a glass construction aquarium, and then you have a plywood base with glass walled aquarium. And that's what I've done with my mixed reef and coral tank. That face piece, I certainly wouldn't be using this. This is just for a model only. This is just pine. But in the tanks I've used something like that, which is just a piece of 90 mil by 19 mil hardwood decking board to use along there. But you can just as easily use something like that. That's some aluminium or some steel or stainless steel. That's up to you. So let me tell you a little story. It was about 25 years ago. I was at uni. I was studying veterinary science at the University of Sydney, and I was sitting in lecture theatres learning about the anatomy of the dog, the anatomy of the horse, and under the guidance of a professor called Dr. Glenn Shea. Now Glenn and I, we got on quite well. We actually had something in common, and that was we were both obsessed with reptiles. However, Glenn's obsession was based around the taxonomy of reptiles, and for you fishy guys, that basically means counting scales. Boring. I, on the other hand, was more obsessed with keeping of the reptiles, in particular lizards. But one thing that Glenn did, which I found really great as a somewhat bored anatomy student, was he'd break up his actual lectures with reptile of the day. So what I'd like to do, by request from one of my YouTube channel viewers, is break up some of my videos with an introduction to my fish family. So now it's time to meet the first member of my fish family. It's time to meet my silver trevally. That's the big torpedo-shaped guy, dead center of the screen there. And at first I didn't actually plan on having a silver trevally in my tank. I caught him on the end of my fishing line when I was out fishing for bream and flathead. But I'm glad I brought him home. At first I thought he was a bit expressionless. You know, he has the big black and white eye and a bit of a benign look in his face. But he's actually a bit of a character. He gets on really well with everybody. He loves to school with the bigger fish. And I may actually get him another companion trevally or two. He's a big boy. He sits around 14 inches long, which is about 35 centimetres, and he potentially will get double that. He's in a 12 by 4 foot by 2 foot high aquarium, and he needs that space. Look how fast he is going for that food. On food, that's the one downside. He won't take pellets. He needs his fresh, meaty seafood, so I feed squid, chopped up sardines, pilchards, and prawns. I actually really enjoy watching this tank. I love the big fish and the movement, and also the bright white light. I've made that on purpose to replicate a real shallow, sandy, sort of estuary style environment. I had some questions from Aquariums Anonymous, JDM, Ben H, and Cyborg Badger. You guys have got some very interesting YouTube names out there. And you guys had some questions regarding how I actually waterproofed the timber. Yeah, concerns about the life of the aquarium, the water seeping into the plywood and rotting the plywood. Well, my original build, which was my plywood base mixed coral reef tank, it's been going for 3 years now. And what I did was I simply used boat coat, which was a 2-part marine epoxy, which is used in Australia in the boat building industry. Key with the epoxy is put enough of it on. Coats. Don't slap it all in one go, but for me, it was building up the layers of the epoxy. If you thin the first coat of epoxy down a little bit with some metho, that actually allows the epoxy to penetrate, that first coat, to penetrate down into the plywood. Then you'd build the layers up upon after that. With the epoxy that I used a wet on wet method. So as soon as the epoxy coating on the plywood went tacky but not dry, I would then recoat. When I'm coating my epoxy, it's really, really easy to do.
See if I can find... No, can't find it. Just thought I had it.
I basically used a white plastic painter's scraper, or a spatula you might call it, and I would screed the epoxy over the plywood. I used a painter's brush just to brush along the edges where there's some dags and things. It was really simple. You could use a roller, but that gets a bit messy, I found. When you're laminating the two pieces of plywood together, you don't really need, well, I didn't use, certainly in my first aquarium build, I don't even think I did it with the second one. I didn't use screws or nails. You can see I've got 5 nails holding these two pieces of plywood together. But what I actually did when I laminated the two pieces of plywood together for the base was I glued them with the epoxy. And there's a nice little trick to help you glue the plywood together. Wait one sec. You can get yourself something like this. And this is it's a filler powder, which is put out by the same epoxy manufacturer. And basically the filler powder is it's like a synthetic powder that's used, when it's mixed with the epoxy, it's probably not great in a shed, when it's mixed with the epoxy, it thickens the epoxy. It converts the epoxy into more of an epoxy glue. I did 3 coats of epoxy onto the plywood. I then made up an epoxy glue using the filling powder, and I screwed that onto one of the pieces of plywood, and then I simply laid the other piece of plywood down on top of it. I weighted it down and it glued extremely well. The reason why I used framing timber as the base of my aquarium outside was simply because of, number one, the size of it, weight of it, and also, I must admit, I was on a bit of a budget. I had some framing timber lying around the farm. Green plywood, 19mm or 25mm, it's really expensive in Australia. Try something different and also save some money if I could. So I built a subfloor, much like a house, using framing timber. Just think of it like joists. And then I actually screwed the piece of plywood on top. And again, I tried something different. I went a little bit cheaper than what I normally would. I used 12mm ply. And you might think, why is he going to 12mm ply when inside he was using 2 sheets of 19mm ply laminated together to 38mm? Well, in essence, if you think about it, I've used 70mm plus 12mm. I've got 82mm of decking thickness and strength compared to 38. One thing I did do, however, was actually put the joists quite close together. I put them at about 300mm apart, which is 1 foot. There wouldn't be any bow or flexing in that plywood. Now the same story applies. Hang on, just wait, I'll come around. The same story applies with my outdoor turtle tank as my indoor tanks. You can see here that here's the subfloor, here's the faceboard. Again, this is just a model. You wouldn't be using this plywood as a faceboard, especially outside. But this plywood, you can see I've set back from the leading edge of the subfloor by the thickness of the glass plus 3mm. So in this case, for the big piece of glass I got here, I set this back 6, 7, 8mm. But outside, I used 12mm glass, so I set it back about 15mm. That then, along with the faceboard, creates that valley that you could fill with silicone after epoxying and recess the glass into. Stay there. So for Aquariums Anonymous, JDM, Ben H and Cyborg Badger, I hope you guys understand that regarding waterproofing plywood. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention about the reason why I overcoated outside. Part epoxy is not UV stable. So if you have a think about any, I don't know, epoxy coated furniture or coffee tables or bar tops or whatever you may have seen, sometimes they go yellow. That yellowing is exposure to light, to UV light. So it's breaking down with that UV light. And inside, where it's covered with gravel and whatnot, it wasn't going to be a problem. So I had to overcoat it. I had to overcoat it because outside we've got exposure to UV light. So I had a couple of choices. I have used polyurethane before to overcoat the epoxy, and that works quite well. It was a little bit expensive. I did do it with my moray tank inside. But what I thought I'd do outside was try an Australian product, which was a pond sealer, and overcoat that. So this near side corner of the aquarium actually has, wrong way, actually has a wall that goes like that. So for the end wall and the back wall of the aquarium, they were screwed down and screwed together to the base of the tank after the base was constructed. After I built the subfloor, installed the plywood, did the epoxying, I then installed the end wall and the back wall. They were already epoxied, and you saw me doing the joint treatments there with the polyurethane and then the pond sealer with the fabric. The glass runs along the front of that stud wall, and so before the glass was installed, this end of the stud wall was also waterproofed with epoxy, the polyurethane and the pond sealer. You're looking on here, bonding it to the actual epoxy on the polyurethane pond sealer on the stud wall, and silicone down that valley, bonding it to the base of the aquarium down there. So that's pretty much how that end wall of the aquarium was built. Had a couple of questions about my glass choice, and I got one here from Dirt Road, Sandy Coves, Maddie Gilbert. Dirt Road, Sandy Coves, Maddie Gilbert, that's quite the YouTube name. In Australia, glass is really expensive. The reason why my two indoor Plywood aquariums are only 600 or 2 feet high is because I recycled the large glass panes from 4 foot, 6 foot and 7 foot tanks. My glass choice for outside, I had to get a bit creative. I started looking on Marketplace, Facebook Marketplace, trying to find second-hand panes of glass, and I came across a bit of an idea which I haven't done before. I did a bit of research on it. I was a little bit worried about it initially, and that was I used pool fencing. So pool fencing in Australia is 12 mil thick, and it's safety glass. There is a distinction between safety glass and float glass, and most aquariums are built from float glass in Australia. This is an example of float glass. Float glass is basically glass that when it actually is hit, it will crack in one long giant crack, often hold together in place and allow you time to empty the tank before, I guess, the vast volume of water and fish gush forth onto the ground in front of it. Safety glass, on the other hand, when it gets a hit, it takes a lot more for it to get damaged. A lot more to get damaged. When it does damage, it explodes into tiny pieces. If you've seen those shattered windscreens on roundabouts on the sides of the road, that's safety glass. So that worried me. That worried me a little bit, and I thought last thing I want to have is a 4,000 litres of aquarium and turtles or rainbow fish just exploding all over the ground. I did some research, however, and I did some pros and cons. I guess in everything in life there's pros and cons, but I made the choice to go ahead using that safety glass. We sometimes get hail with our summer storms, and hail hitting float glass can be bad news. But hitting safety glass, not so much of a problem. If you're in Australia and you're trying to look for doing to build some aquariums, particularly some outdoor aquariums, have a think about using some recycled pool fencing. Nico's Centre Court, Lapidary Larry, Put a bag over your face, you need it. It's a bit rough. John Gabriel, Leon Hughes, Scott McPherson, Mark Vanderloos, Gareth Rasmussen, Kyle Webb and Paul Demke all had something to say about the way I butt joined the 2 panes of glass along the front. That was a bit of an experiment. Well, it's not an experiment. I've done it before inside with my moray tank. Only 600 high though, and that was using the float glass. So outside, it's the second time I've done it. For Giga Chad, who assumed I wasn't doing an update because it was leaking, I'll show you outside. She's still going strong, she's not leaking. I'm not going to pretend that this tank's going to last forever. In fact, no aquarium's going to last forever. And I don't expect it to, or any of my aquariums. I tend to be rather handy, I love my tools, I love building things, and I give things a go. I'm not going to panic if something goes wrong. I've got used to that from living on a farm and growing my own my produce and having to overcome structural and problematic issues all the time. So I haven't got a problem with trying something new. Should you do that? Well, that's up to you. I'm not saying what I've done is the right way to do it. I'm just explaining to you how I did it. I'm not concerned at this stage that it's going to be going anywhere in the near future. But let me explain my rationale for butt joining the 2 front panes of glass that way. Rig up a bit of a support here to demonstrate things for you. So that's the decking and the front fascia board with the recess, just like outside in the turtle tank. We've got our 1 pane of glass, much like that. And our 2nd pane of glass, this one's a bit thinner. I might just use this wedge to hold it in place, just like that. And that's the join that's worrying everybody, I think. Funnily enough, when I did it, I wasn't worried. It's funny, human nature, when you start to get input, good and bad, from other people, where you start to question yourself. But in hindsight, it is what it is, and I'm quite happy with the outcome. Alright guys, so here's the 2 panes of glass that you've been most concerned about. I've set it up here in the front recess of the floor of the Plywood aquarium, and I've installed my end wall, butted in. As I mentioned before, this pane of glass, you pretend it lines up nicely with this stud wall. I siliconed to the end of this wall, as well as install a piece of angle, it was aluminium angle, across the face. It was 100 by 50 mil, so I siliconed it to the glass along the face, and where it wrapped around the edge of the timber framing, I screwed it into the timber. What I did after I actually installed the 2 panes of glass and siliconed them in place is I installed some metal angle as bracing along the top, just like that. Now obviously this is not true to scale, but it gives you the idea. I used a metal angle is because traditionally in aquariums you'd use a glass strip for the bracing on the inside. They're usually smaller aquariums. I'm not particularly proficient at cutting glass, and so I chose to use an angle that would actually silicon along the face, and where it wraps over, it allows a ledge to actually provide the cross bracing back to the rear of the aquarium. The angle itself is a really rigid profile of metal. Like, it's really hard to bend that. It spans from one end all the way down to the other end of the aquarium. Where it overlaps, let's see if I can show you this here, where it actually overlaps the top edge of the framing, I screwed down into that timber through the actual angle. Where it actually met in the corners of the aquarium, glass on glass, and the aluminium angle went in the backward direction, I bolted it together. And what I actually did also was I installed cross braces from the front of the aquarium to the back of the aquarium, bolted to the angle backwards and screwed down into the stud walling at the rear of the aquarium. My rationale here is these 2 panes of glass can't move in relation to each other. They're locked in place at the bottom in the same channel. They're aligned and locked in place at the top using the continuous strip of angle. So what I did then was I siliconed a bridging piece of flat bar across the face of the two glass panes to bridge that joint, say, or linking the two panes of glass together in the center. The silicone I used to do that was very good quality structural silicone used for professional glazing in skyscrapers. I sound like an American, don't I? Commercial buildings. That's a glazing which is exposed to high wind loads, so the silicone itself needs to be very structural. I actually did a complete layer of silicone. I just didn't do squiggles, I just didn't do dots. I completely coated the underside of the flat bar or the angle so that when it actually was put in place, it provided a very good adherence to the glass behind it. So that's basically it. Have fun. Don't be scared about building your own aquarium. I think using plywood is a fantastic choice of materials, especially where the panes of glass that you're going to use become prohibitively expensive because of the dimensions or the size of them. So as I mentioned before, large sheets of glass, particularly thick sheets of glass in Australia, are really expensive. So where you start talking about aquariums that are 3 foot front to back, 4 foot front to back, using glass in the base of those aquariums, really expensive. And I would use plywood, epoxy plywood 100% every time for an aquarium with a base of those dimensions.